Long before Islam united Arabia, powerful Arab kingdoms stood as the ultimate kingmakers between two ancient superpowers. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving into the story of a brilliant, pragmatic ruler who literally weaponized his desert kingdom, Al-Mundhir III. His story has got it all: epic desert battles, incredibly wealthy cosmopolitan cities, and high-stakes geopolitical maneuvering that absolutely changed the course of history. I want you to just imagine the blinding dust of Lakhmid heavy cavalry charging across the desert with the sun catching their Persian-style armor. It's a striking image, right? We're setting the stage for an era where Arab kingdoms weren't just bystanders. They were feared adversaries and highly respected allies. We're talking about a time long before the rise of Islam, when the Arabian frontier was arguably the most volatile borderland in the entire world. So, let's look at the grand geopolitical chessboard of late antiquity, because the tension here is just unbelievable. On one side, you've got the massive Byzantine Empire, and they're allied with their Arab client state, the Ghassanids. And on the flip side, you have the mighty Sasanian Persian Empire, backed by their own Arab allies, the Lakhmid Kingdom. Both of these massive empires desperately needed these Arab buffer states. They used them to fight their proxy wars, secure vital trade routes, and protect their borders from nomadic raids. It is classic proxy warfare. And stepping right into the middle of this powder keg around 503 CE is our guy, Al-Mundhir III, taking the Lakhmid throne. Ruling from the city of Al-Hirah, he wasn't about to just sit back and be a quiet, obedient vassal for the Sasanian Persians. No way. He took this buffer state and rapidly transformed it into a formidable, incredibly mobile military machine, one that projected power deep into Byzantine territory and all across the Arabian Peninsula. Let's actually get into his military career, an era we can basically call the Sasanian sword. Al-Mundhir III essentially became the Sasanian Empire's most lethal weapon on their western frontier. Because he had a huge amount of autonomy, he was able to launch these incredibly agile, devastating operations. And the heavy traditional Roman armies, they severely struggled to counter those kinds of rapid hit-and-run tactics. The pace he kept up was honestly terrifying for his enemies. During the Iberian War, while the Byzantines were completely distracted up in the Caucasus, Al-Mundhir unleashed his mobile desert cavalry to just bypass Roman defenses entirely. He ravaged Syria in 528, struck toward Epimea in 529, and then delivered this crushing flanking blow at the Battle of Callinicum in 531 against Emperor Justinian's forces. He was systematically dismantling Byzantine border security piece by piece. But of course, all this aggressive expansion sparked a very bitter, very bloody rivalry with the Ghassanids. Now remember, the Ghassanids were the Byzantine Empire's Arab allies, their foederati, tasked with defending those Syrian frontiers. So this wasn't just some abstract war between distant emperors. This was an intensely personal, highly localized conflict between two Arab kingdoms fighting tooth and nail for dominance, wealth, and prestige out in the Syrian desert. And the sheer scale of these warfare is wild. 10,000. Historical sources actually indicate that Al-Mundhir could mobilize up to 10,000 Arab horsemen for joint expeditions with the Persians. Think about that for a second. That is absolutely massive. It proves that these pre-Islamic Arab polities had evolved way, way beyond small raiding bands. They were highly organized, decisive military powers, fully capable of turning the tide of massive imperial wars. But to really get a handle on who Al-Mundhir was, we need to step away from the battlefield and travel to his capital city, Al-Hirah. This place was known as the Jewel of the Euphrates. It wasn't just a military camp. It was an incredibly vibrant, deeply cosmopolitan city. We're talking palaces, monasteries, taverns. It served as a massive hub where the lucrative incense and silk trade routes all intersected. What's really fascinating here is how Al-Mundhir managed such an incredibly diverse population. He had to balance the founding Tanukh tribes, a conglomerate of allied merchant groups, and the Ibad, which was a super influential community of Nestorian Christians. So here is Al-Mundhir, balancing his own traditional Arabian polytheistic beliefs in a city filled with the echoing chants of Christian monasteries. Honestly, it was an absolute masterclass in pragmatic governance. Historical records back this up, showing Al-Hirah as a true commercial powerhouse. The Christian Ibad elites were bilingual in Arabic and Syriac, making them perfect administrators and translators. Under Al-Mundhir's oversight, they facilitated this massive cultural exchange between Syriac and Arabic traditions. And that tolerance? That's exactly what allowed the city to thrive economically, seamlessly blending Persian, Arab, and Christian influences.
But it wasn't just about religion and trade. Al-Mundhir's royal court became the ultimate sanctuary for early Arabic poets. Now, in pre-Islamic Arabia, poetry was essentially the mass media of the day. It was how news and ideas spread. By bringing celebrated poets right into his court, Al-Mundhir bridged the gap between nomadic oral traditions and settled urban life. He basically used cultural patronage to bind fractious tribes to his throne. He was as much a cultural architect as he was a warrior.
Okay, let's put on our historical detective hats for a minute. Assessing Al-Mundhir's true character is complicated, to say the least. The ancient sources wildly disagree on what kind of man he actually was. And that largely depends on who was holding the pen and what empire or religion they happened to represent. It's like looking at totally different people. For example, Byzantine historians like Procopius, they respected him as a terrifying but brilliant tactical genius who constantly outmaneuvered Roman armies. But then you read the Syriac chronicles, and they recount his actions with utter horror. They document instances where he allegedly sacrificed 400 captured Christian nuns to the pagan war goddess El-Uzza. As objective learners, it's wild to see the same ruler framed simultaneously as a strategic mastermind and a brutal religious adversary.
Then you look at early Arabic historians like Al-Tabari, and they offer a completely different view. They glorify Al-Mundhir's reign as the absolute peak of Lakhmid power. To them, he's the archetypal pre-Islamic monarch, a total master of tribal diplomacy, a generous patron of the arts, and the guy who unified the Arabs under a single banner. So we get this fascinating blend of factual history with some definite legendary embellishments. But all of this, the complex military campaigns, the cultural flourishing, it all culminated in June 554 CE. Al-Mundhir led his forces into northern Syria for a massive, decisive clash with his great rivals, the Ghassanids. It's known as the Battle of Yam Halima. And despite a literal lifetime of victories, the Lakhmid forces were finally overwhelmed. Al-Mundhir III was struck down and killed right there on the battlefield.
As you might guess, his sudden death triggered immediate instability, and ultimately a tragic end for his kingdom. First, bitter succession rivalries erupted among his sons. It was chaos. Then, fearing they'd lose control of the region, the Sasanian Persians stepped in and installed direct oversight. Finally, the Lakhmids lost their autonomy completely, and the entire dynasty was abolished by the Persians in 602 CE. But here is the crazy part. Absorbing the Lakhmid Kingdom was a massive strategic blunder by the Persians. By removing this powerful, highly organized Arab buffer state and trying to just rule the desert frontier directly, the Sasanians inadvertently left themselves incredibly vulnerable. They essentially shattered their own shield, right before the unified Islamic armies would emerge from Arabia just a few short decades later. Ultimately, the story of Al-Mundhir III is absolutely foundational to understanding the ancient world. Empires have vanished, cities have fallen, and kingdoms have turned to ruins. Yet his story reminds us that long before the rise of Islam, Arab rulers were already profoundly shaping the politics, economics, and culture of the Near East. They weren't just bystanders watching the Romans and Persians fight, they were formidable players dictating the very borders of empires. Which leaves us with a really fascinating question to ponder. If the Sasanian Empire had just maintained the strong Lakhmid buffer state that Al-Mundhir built, instead of letting it fracture and collapse, could they have survived the coming Islamic conquests? It's a brilliant what-if that highlights just how fragile empires really are and shows us the hidden pivot points of history. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning history.